You have 10 seconds to take your trash bag to the back row, or I will have the police drag you off for theft, Captain Miller screamed, pointing a shaking finger at the black woman sitting in seat 1A. The first-class cabin went deadly silent, but Ebele didn't flinch. She calmly turned a page in a thick technical manual, not even looking up. "Captain," she said, her voice steady, "you should worry less about my seat and more about the number 4 hydraulic valve that is currently leaking." Miller froze, unaware he was yelling at the billionaire who owned the plane. The first-class cabin of the Boeing 777 was a sanctuary designed to make the world outside disappear. It was a hushed, golden-hued temple of soft Italian leather, recessed lighting, and the delicate clink of crystal champagne flutes. The air here was scrubbed clean, scented with fresh orchids and money. It was a space reserved for the masters of the universe, CEOs, diplomats, and movie stars. Captain Miller stepped out of the cockpit to perform his pre-flight meet and greet, a ritual he usually enjoyed. He loved the deference in the passengers' eyes, the way they looked at his 4 stripes with reassurance. He scanned the cabin, noting the usual clientele, a tech mogul in 2F, a famous actress in 3A. Then his eyes landed on seat 1A. The smile slid off his face like oil off a non-stick pan. There, in the most exclusive seat on the plane, the seat with the extra legroom and the panoramic window, sat the woman from the gate, Ebele. She looked violently out of place. Amidst the cashmere sweaters and tailored suits, her pilling beige wool coat looked like a dirty rag thrown onto a pristine white sofa. She had placed her fraying canvas tote bag on the polished walnut console, right next to a vase of white roses. To Miller, it looked like someone had dumped a bag of trash on the altar of a church. Miller felt a vein throb in his temple. He pulled out his phone and checked the standby list. His good friend, Senator Davis, was currently squeezed into a middle seat in business class because the flight was full. Senator Davis, who could influence aviation legislation. Senator Davis, who invited Miller to golf at Augusta. Miller looked at the senator's name on the list. Then he looked at Ebele. The calculation was instant. It wasn't just a preference. In Miller's mind, it was a moral imperative to correct this error. The universe had made a mistake, and he was the hand of God here to fix it. He adjusted his tie, threw his shoulders back, and marched down the aisle. He didn't approach Ebele from the side. He stood directly in front of her, blocking the overhead light, casting a long shadow over her face. Ebele was reading. She wasn't looking at the in-flight entertainment menu. She was studying a thick, spiral-bound binder full of schematics. "Excuse me," Miller said. He didn't use his customer service voice. He used his command voice, loud, slow, and devoid of warmth. Ebele marked her page with a calm, deliberate movement and looked up. Behind her thick glasses, her eyes were magnified, steady, and unblinking. "Yes, Captain?" she asked softly. "We have a situation," Miller lied smoothly, his voice carrying enough for the surrounding passengers to hear. "There has been a duplicate booking error in the system. Seat 1A is reserved for a high-priority government official." He gestured vaguely toward the curtain separating them from business class. "I'm going to need you to gather your things," he paused, glancing at her canvas bag with open disgust, "and relocate." Ebele didn't move. She didn't panic. She didn't check her ticket. "My ticket is for seat 1A, she stated simply. "I purchased it at the counter. There is no duplicate." Miller's jaw tightened. She was resisting. He hated resistance. "Listen to me," Miller said, lowering his voice to a menacing growl, leaning in closer so she could smell the peppermint of his breath. "Let's be real for a second. Look around you." He swept his hand across the cabin. "This environment is designed for a certain aesthetic. It is a place of relaxation and quiet for our VIP guests. People pay thousands of dollars for this experience." He looked her up and down, his gaze lingering on her worn-out shoes. "Frankly, your presence here is disrupting the ambiance. Your attire, your luggage, it is making the other guests uncomfortable. You don't fit the profile, madam." It was a slap in the face, delivered with words instead of a hand. A hush fell over the front rows. The tech mogul in 2F lowered his headphones. Miller straightened up, assuming the shame would make her fold. "I have made arrangements for you," he continued, acting as if he were bestowing a great kindness. "There is a seat open in row 54. It's right near the rear lavatories. It's very convenient, and you'll be around people who are more like you." The implication was clear. Go to the back of the bus where the poor people belong. Ebele looked at him. For a moment, Miller thought he saw a flash of amusement in her eyes, which infuriated him. She should be crying. She should be apologizing. "I prefer the window in 1A, Ebele said, her voice remaining perfectly level. "And I find the ambiance quite pleasant. The only thing disrupting the peace, Captain, is you." Miller's face turned a shade of crimson. The audacity, the sheer unmitigated gall of this woman. He felt his authority slipping. She wasn't listening to the uniform. He decided she must be stupid. Or perhaps she just didn't understand English well enough to know he was threatening her. He switched tactics. He spoke slower, louder, enunciating every syllable like he was talking to a toddler or a golden retriever. "You do not understand," Miller said, chopping the air with his hand. "I am the captain. This is my plane." He pointed to his chest, tapping the gold wings. "When I give an order, it is federal law. If you do not move to row 54 right now, I will treat this as a security threat. I will have you removed. Do you understand police? Do you understand jail?" He leaned down again, his face inches from hers, his voice dropping to a hiss. "I am trying to do you a favor. Seat 1A is for people who matter. Now take your trash bag and get to the back before I lose my temper." Ebele looked at the finger pointing in her face. She looked at the vein throbbing in his neck. She slowly picked up her technical manual. "My ticket is valid," she repeated, turning back to her reading. "And unless you want to explain to the FAA why you delayed a flight to swap a paying passenger for a golfing buddy, I suggest you return to the cockpit. I believe your pre-flight checklist is incomplete." Miller stood there, stunned. He was vibrating with rage. She knew. She knew about the senator, and she was dismissing him like a servant. He opened his mouth to scream, to call the marshals, to drag her out by her coat. But the flight attendant, Veronica, touched his arm gently. "Captain," she whispered nervously, nodding toward the other passengers who were now holding up their phones, recording. "We're already 10 minutes behind schedule. The tower is asking for pushback." Miller looked at the phones. He looked at Ebele, who was ignoring him completely. He ground his teeth together so hard they creaked. He couldn't drag her out now, not with the cameras rolling. He had to wait. He would deal with her in the air. Or better yet, he would have the police waiting at Heathrow. "Fine," Miller spat, straightening his jacket. He glared at Ebele with pure hatred. "Stay, but don't expect any service. And don't you dare speak to anyone." He spun on his heel and stormed back to the cockpit, slamming the reinforced door behind him. He thought he had lost a battle. He didn't know he had just declared war on the commanding general. The heavy cockpit door clicked open again, shattering the fragile truce that had settled over the first-class cabin. Captain Miller stepped back out, his face composed into a mask of regretful authority, but his eyes burned with a vindictive fire. He wasn't going to let a woman in a thrift store coat win. He wasn't going to let his authority be undermined in front of his crew and his wealthy passengers. He stopped in the center of the aisle, holding up a hand to silence the low murmur of conversation. "Ladies and gentlemen," Miller announced, his voice projecting with practiced gravity. "I apologize for the delay in our departure. Unfortunately, we have a security protocol situation that requires immediate resolution." He turned his gaze slowly, theatrically, towards seat 1A. "Federal aviation regulations grant me, as pilot in command, the absolute authority to refuse transport to any passenger deemed a risk to the safety or order of the flight," Miller declaimed, reciting the rule like a priest reading scripture. "We have a passenger who has refused a direct crew instruction. We cannot push back from the gate until this is resolved." He looked directly at Ebele. "Ma'am, I am giving you one final opportunity. You are causing a disturbance. You are holding up 200 people. You will vacate this seat and move to the rear of the aircraft immediately, or I will have airport security remove you from the vessel entirely. It is your choice. Row 54 or a jail cell. The ultimatum hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. The cabin atmosphere shifted instantly. The passengers, previously indifferent or mildly amused, now turned hostile. Their comfort was threatened. Their schedules were at risk. "Oh, for heaven's sake!" the tech mogul in seat 2F groaned, loudly snapping his laptop shut. "Just move, lady! I have a merger meeting in London in 7 hours." "Seriously," a woman in pearls chimed in from across the aisle, clutching her champagne flute. "Why do people like this always have to cause a scene? Just go to your seat." "Selfish," someone muttered from the back. The social pressure was a physical weight. Dozens of eyes bored into Abele, judging her, blaming her. To them, she wasn't a victim of discrimination, she was an inconvenience. She was the obstacle standing between them and their destination. Abele looked around the cabin. She saw the impatience in their faces. She checked her watch. A delay now would miss the Heathrow landing slot, costing the airline, her airline, thousands of pounds in fines and fuel. She looked at Miller, who was standing with his arms crossed, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. He knew he had won. He had weaponized the crowd against her. Abele took a deep breath. She wasn't surrendering to him. She was protecting the schedule. She was making a command decision, even if no one else knew it. Slowly, with an agonizing calmness, she closed her thick technical manual. She placed it into her fraying canvas tote. She stood up. "Very well, Captain," Abele said. Her voice was quiet, but in the silence of the cabin it carried clearly. "I will move. I would hate to be the reason your passengers are late." Miller's chest puffed out. He stepped aside, gesturing mockingly toward the long, narrow aisle leading to the back of the plane. "Right this way. Economy is straight back. Keep walking until you hit the wall." Abele stepped out of the pod. She adjusted her coat. She began the long, humiliating walk past the rows of staring faces. She walked with her head high, her back straight, refusing to look down. As she passed Captain Miller, she paused. They were inches apart. Miller looked down at her with a look of supreme triumph. He expected a curse word. He expected a plea. Instead, Abele leaned in. She lowered her voice to a whisper, intimate and precise. "Captain," she said, her tone shifting from passenger to professional. "The pressure in the left main landing gear, inboard tire, is reading 10 psi below standard. I noticed the compression when I boarded. It's within the safety margin for taxiing, but you should log it for maintenance in London." Miller blinked. The smile froze on his face. Abele didn't wait for a response. She hoisted her canvas bag onto her shoulder and continued walking, disappearing through the curtain into the bustling, noisy world of economy class. For a second, Miller stood there, processing the words. Left main gear, inboard tire, 10 psi. It was gibberish. It was nonsense. Then the absurdity of it hit him. He burst out laughing. It was a loud, booming laugh that invited the rest of the cabin to join in. He turned to the passengers, shaking his head, wiping a tear from his eye. "Did you hear that?" Miller announced, gesturing toward the empty curtain where Abele had vanished. "Can you believe it? The bag lady just gave me technical advice." He chuckled, looking at the tech mogul in 2F. "She told me to check my tire pressure," Miller mocked, tapping his temple. "Unbelievable. She thinks she's a mechanic. I guess wandering around airports looking through trash cans makes you an expert in Boeing 777 engineering, folks." The cabin erupted in laughter. The tension broke. The rich and powerful chuckled along with their captain, shaking their heads at the insanity of the poor woman. "She's clearly mentally unstable," the woman in pearls whispered loudly. "Good thing you moved her, Captain. Who knows what she would have done?" "Exactly," Miller beamed, soaking up the validation. "Safety first, ladies and gentlemen. Safety first." He turned back to the cockpit, feeling lighter than air. He had crushed the rebellion. He had restored order. He had put the crazy woman in her place. He sat down in the pilot's seat, strapping himself in. He looked at the instrument panel, glowing with hundreds of lights and gauges. He didn't check the tire pressure sensors. Why would he? He wasn't going to take advice from a woman who couldn't even afford a suitcase. He grabbed the radio. "Tower, this is Sterling 882, ready for pushback." He pushed the throttle forward, confident, powerful, and completely oblivious to the fact that the crazy woman in row 54 was the only person on board who knew exactly what was about to happen. The Atlantic Ocean was a serene sheet of endless blue, 30,000 feet below. Inside the cockpit of Flight 882, the mood was equally tranquil. Captain Miller had the autopilot engaged, his feet resting comfortably, a fresh cup of coffee in his hand. He was feeling good. He had put the problem passenger in her place, the flight was making up time, and the senator would owe him a favor for the upgrade. "Smooth sailing, skipper," the co-pilot, a young man named Evans, said, checking the navigation display. "We'll be wheels down in London 10 minutes early." Miller nodded, taking a sip of coffee. "That's how pros do it, Evans. You don't let distractions get in the way of—" Clang! The sound wasn't an explosion. It was the sickening metallic groan of something structural giving way deep within the belly of the beast. The plane didn't just bump, it shuddered, a violent lateral convulsion that felt like a giant hand had slapped the fuselage. Miller's coffee cup flew out of his hand, splashing hot liquid across the center console. Before the brown liquid could even drip to the floor, the cockpit erupted. "Whoop, whoop! Pull up! Ding, 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 ding!" The master caution alarm, the sound every pilot dreads, pierced the air, a relentless, shrieking siren that obliterated the silence. The dashboard, previously a calming constellation of green and amber, lit up like a Christmas tree in hell. Red. Everything was red. "What the hell was that?" Evans yelled, his voice cracking. "Autopilot disengaged!" Miller shouted, grabbing the yoke. "I have control!" Or, "God, I don't have control!" The yoke, usually responsive to the lightest touch, felt as if it were set in concrete. It was stiff, fighting him. The horizon line on the artificial horizon display began to tilt. 10 degrees, 20 degrees. The plane was rolling left, hard. "Hydraulics!" Evans screamed, staring at the engine indicating and crew alerting system. "We lost System A! Pressure is dropping like a stone! 0 psi! Wait! System B is fluctuating! We're losing both!" Miller's heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. Hydraulics. Not the tires, not the engines. The hydraulics were the blood of the plane. Without them, the flaps, the rudder, the ailerons, the very muscles that allowed the bird to fly, were dead weight. "Get the QRH!" Miller barked, sweat instantly drenching his shirt. "Checklist! Loss of hydraulic pressure!" Evans fumbled for the quick reference handbook, his hands shaking so badly he nearly dropped it. He tore through the pages, the paper tearing in his panic. I can't find it," Evans cried. "It says loss of System A or loss of System B. It doesn't say both. The manual assumes redundancy. It doesn't account for a total bleed-out." The plane groaned again, tilting further. The coffee cup rolled across the floor. They were banking past 30 degrees. Gravity was shifting. "Mayday! Mayday! Mayday!" Miller screamed into the headset, his voice stripped of all its earlier arrogance. "Sterling 882 declaring emergency. We have a critical flight control failure. We are losing altitude. Request immediate vectors." "Sterling 882, the air traffic controller's voice came back, crackling with static, calm but distant. "Copy emergency. State intentions." "Intentions?" Miller laughed, a hysterical, terrified sound. "My intention is not to die. The stick is dead. The rudder is jammed. Tell me what to do." "Roger, 882. Stand by." "Don't tell me to stand by," Miller roared, slamming his hand against the useless instrument panel. "I need a solution. The book is wrong. The book is empty." For the first time in his career, the god of the sky was powerless. His 4 stripes meant nothing. His expensive watch meant nothing. He was just a man in a falling metal tube, fighting a machine that had decided to kill him. Back in the cabin, the illusion of luxury had vanished. The violent bank had sent champagne flutes smashing against the walls. The overhead bins rattled like maracas. Then the main cabin lights flickered and died, replaced by the eerie, dim glow of the emergency floor strips. Snap! The overhead compartments hissed open. Hundreds of yellow oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling like dead jungle vines. "Put your masks on!" a flight attendant screamed, her voice shrill with terror. "Heads down! Heads down!" Panic, raw and primal, swept through the plane. In first class, the woman in pearls was sobbing, clutching her necklace as if it could save her. The tech mogul was hyperventilating into the yellow cup. The veneer of civilization peeled away instantly. There were no VIPs anymore, just frightened animals trapped in a cage. "We're going to crash!" someone shrieked from row 10. "Oh God, we're going down!" The plane lurched again, the G-force pinning everyone to their seats. The sound of wind rushing past the fuselage grew louder, a roar of impending doom. But in the very back of the plane, in row 54, seat E, there was a strange island of calm. Ebele sat wedged between the lavatory wall and a terrified teenager. The air was thick with the smell of fear and spilled soda. The mask dangled in front of her face. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She reached up, secured the mask over her nose and mouth with practiced efficiency, and tightened the strap. Her breathing was slow, rhythmic. While everyone else was looking at the ceiling, praying to their gods, Ebele was looking at the floor. She felt the vibration through the soles of her cheap shoes. She felt the specific shudder of the yaw damper failing. She felt the skid of the plane as the rudder locked. She opened her canvas tote bag. Her hands, steady as a surgeon's, pulled out the thick technical manual, the one Miller had mocked. She flipped it open to a page she had bookmarked years ago, a page titled Catastrophic Multi-System Failure, Theoretical Override Protocols. She looked at the diagram. She looked at the angle of the plane. She knew exactly what was happening. The number 4 valve hadn't just leaked, it had burst, creating a back pressure wave that blew out the check valves for the backup system. It was a design flaw she had argued against in a board meeting 2 decades ago. The engineers had told her it was statistically impossible. Statistics, Ebele whispered into her mask, her eyes narrowing behind her thick glasses. Always the optimists. She unbuckled her seatbelt. The teenager next to her grabbed her arm, eyes wide with horror. "Lady, what are you doing? Sit down! We're gonna die!" Ebele looked at him. Behind the lenses, her eyes were hard, sharp, and blazing with an intensity that silenced him. "Not today," she said, her voice muffled by the mask but undeniable. "Hold my bag." She stood up. The plane was tilted at a 40-degree angle. Walking was like climbing a mountain during an earthquake. Gravity fought her. The chaos fought her. But Ebele grabbed the headrest of the seat in front of her. She pulled herself forward. Then the next seat. Then the next. She moved against the flow of panic. She moved toward the cockpit. She was a ghost in a beige coat, climbing up a falling plane, the only person on board who knew that the solution wasn't in the pilot's manual. It was in her head. The atmosphere in the cockpit shifted from panic to a terrified reverence. Captain Miller stared at the woman standing behind him. Moments ago, she was a nuisance in a beige coat. Now she was the only reason they were still airborne. The plane was leveling out, but the vibration in the floorboards warned them that the danger was far from over. "Move," Ebele ordered. It wasn't a request. She looked at the co-pilot, Evans, who was pale and shaking, staring at his trembling hands as if they didn't belong to him. "Son, get out of that seat. You're in shock. Go sit in the jump seat and strap in." Evans didn't argue. He unbuckled frantically and scrambled out of the chair, collapsing into the observer's seat behind them. Ebele dropped her canvas tote bag on the floor and slid into the co-pilot's seat. She adjusted the headset over her ears, pushing her thick glasses up her nose. Miller watched her, his mouth slightly open. "You can't sit there," he stammered, his brain trying to cling to regulations that no longer mattered. "That's a restricted station." "Fly the plane, Miller," Ebele said, her hands moving across the instrument panel with a fluidity that made Miller dizzy. "Focus on the horizon. I'll manage the systems." She didn't look at the labels on the switches. Her fingers danced across the overhead panel, isolating the damaged hydraulic circuits and rerouting power to the secondary flight computer. She adjusted the fuel flow to balance the weight distribution, compensating for the drag on the left side. "The rudder is still jammed 5 degrees left," Ebele announced calmly, monitoring the digital readout. "I'm setting up a differential thrust profile on the engines to counteract the yaw. You're going to feel the right engine spool up. Don't fight it." "Differential thrust?" Miller whispered. That's a simulator scenario." Nobody does that in a live emergency with a full passenger load. Nobody who wants to crash, maybe, Ebele retorted. She punched a sequence into the flight management computer. Engaging thrust asymmetry now. The plane shuddered as the right engine roared to life with increased power, pushing the nose straight against the resistance of the stuck rudder. The aircraft straightened out, flying true for the first time in 10 minutes. Miller gripped the yoke, his knuckles white. He looked at the woman beside him. She was calm, unnaturally calm. She looked like she was sitting at a library desk, not wrestling a 300-ton metal beast back from the brink of death. "How?" Miller asked, his voice trembling. "How do you know the bypass codes? How do you know the thrust ratios by heart? You're sitting in economy. You're wearing—" He stopped himself, looking at her coat. Ebele didn't look up from the screens. "I'm wearing a coat I bought 20 years ago," she said. "The same year I led the design team for the hydraulic control assembly of the Boeing 777-200ER. Miller froze. The air in the cockpit seemed to leave his lungs. You're a mechanic?" Miller asked, the condescension from earlier bleeding back into his voice, desperate to make sense of the world. Ebele finally looked at him. Her eyes were sharp, magnifying the intensity of her gaze. "I am not a mechanic, Captain," she said, her voice cold and precise. "I am an aeronautical engineer. I possess a dual doctorate in fluid dynamics and avionics from MIT. I didn't just fix this plane. I wrote the blueprints for the very system that just failed." She gestured to the warning light that was still blinking amber on the dashboard. "That valve failure?" Ebele continued, turning back to the controls. "I wrote a memorandum to the FAA in 1998 predicting that under specific high-stress load cycles, the number 4 valve would suffer metal fatigue. I recommended a titanium alloy replacement. The accountants said it was too expensive. They said the failure probability was negligible." She adjusted a dial, smoothing out the flight path. "I guess the probability wasn't 0 after all," she murmured. Miller stared at her. The woman he had ordered to move because she ruined the aesthetic of first class was the architect of the machine keeping them alive. He remembered stepping on her ticket. He remembered calling her a vagrant. Shame, hot and suffocating, washed over him, mixing with the lingering fear. "We need to prepare for approach," Ebele said, cutting through his internal crisis. "Heathrow is 20 miles out. We have no flaps, limited braking, and a rudder that wants to kill us. This is going to be a fast landing, Captain. Do exactly what I say when I say it." Miller swallowed hard. He nodded. For the first time in his life, he didn't feel like the commander. He felt like a student. "Yes, ma'am," Miller whispered. "Don't call me ma'am," Ebele said, her eyes locked on the altimeter. "Call me Sterling. Ebele Sterling." Miller's head snapped toward her. "Sterling? As in Sterling Airways?" Ebele didn't answer. She keyed the radio, her voice broadcasting clearly to the terrified air traffic control tower in London. "London Tower, this is Sterling 882. We are on final approach. Heavy emergency. Requesting full runway length and emergency services rolling. We are coming in hot." She glanced at Miller, a small, grim smile touching her lips. "Try not to scratch the paint, Captain. I own this plane." The runway at Heathrow rushed up to meet them, not as a welcoming strip of asphalt, but as a gray blur of concrete moving far too fast. Without flaps to slow their descent, the massive Boeing 777 was coming in like a missile. Ebele's hands were steady on the throttles, manipulating the engine thrust to keep the nose straight, fighting the invisible hand of the wind that tried to push them off the center line. Touchdown was not graceful. The landing gear slammed into the tarmac with a violence that rattled every tooth in Miller's head. The aircraft bounced once, heavy and terrifying, before settling onto its wheels. Ebele immediately slammed the reverse thrusters, the engines roaring in protest as they tried to arrest the momentum of 300 tons of metal moving at nearly 200 miles per hour. The brakes screamed against the friction. The smell of burning rubber permeated the cockpit, thick and acrid. Miller stomped on the rudder pedals, forgetting they were useless, while Ebele managed the steering with the engines alone, dancing the plane down the center of the runway until it finally, miraculously, shuddered to a halt. For a moment, there was absolute silence. Then, the cabin behind them erupted. It wasn't just cheering, it was the primal, hysterical release of people who had prepared to die and been granted a reprieve. Miller slumped in his seat, his uniform soaked in sweat, his chest heaving. He looked over at Ebele. She was already unbuckling her harness, her face returning to that impassive mask she wore at the gate. She picked up her canvas tote bag and her thick technical manual, dusting off an invisible speck of lint from her beige coat. Outside, the world was flashing blue and red. Fire trucks, ambulances, and police cruisers swarmed the aircraft like frantic beetles. The emergency stairs were already rising to the forward fuselage door. Miller took a deep breath. His heart rate began to slow, and as the fear receded, his survival instinct, and his ego, came roaring back. He realized the position he was in. He had lost control. He had panicked. A passenger had flown his plane. If the investigation revealed that, his career was over. He needed a narrative. He needed a villain. He looked at Ebele, who was standing up, her knees cracking slightly. "Stay right there," Miller commanded, his voice regaining its sharp, authoritarian edge. He stood up, smoothing his jacket, checking his reflection in the dark monitor. "You breached the cockpit. You interfered with flight crew operations. You are going to wait here for the authorities." Ebele looked at him, unimpressed. "I just saved your life, Miller, and the lives of everyone on board." "You hijacked my plane," Miller corrected, rewriting history in real time. "I had the situation under control. You forced your way in. That is a federal crime." The cockpit door opened. A flood of cold air entered, followed immediately by the London Metropolitan Police and a man in a sharp, expensive suit who looked like he had run a marathon to get there. It was Arthur Henderson, the CEO of the airline, his face pale and terrified. Miller stepped forward, blocking their view of Ebele. He threw his shoulders back, assuming the posture of the hero. "Mr. Henderson," Miller said, projecting his voice to be heard over the sirens outside. "Thank God you're here. It was a nightmare up there. We had a critical failure, but I managed to bring her down." He pointed an accusing finger behind him at Ebele. "Officer, arrest that woman immediately. She is a deranged passenger from economy. She broke into the flight deck during the emergency. She threatened the crew and attempted to manipulate the controls. I barely managed to land with her screaming in my ear." The police officers stepped forward, hands on their holsters, looking at the small woman in the beige coat standing by the co-pilot's chair. Miller smiled internally. It was perfect. She was the crazy scapegoat. He was the steely veteran who saved the day despite the interference. "Get her out of here," Miller spat. "She's a danger to aviation." Arthur Henderson, the CEO, didn't look at Miller. He didn't look at the police. His eyes locked onto the woman in the beige coat. His jaw dropped. He pushed past Miller so violently that the captain stumbled back against the console. "Madam President!" Henderson shouted, his voice cracking with emotion. He didn't arrest her. He ran to her. He grabbed her hands, checking her for injuries, his posture one of absolute deference and relief. "My God, Ebele!" Henderson gasped, ignoring the stunned silence of the police and the captain. "We were watching the telemetry from the tower. The data, it showed a total hydraulic collapse. We thought we lost you. We thought we lost the plane." Miller blinked. He looked from his boss to the bag lady. The words echoed in his head. "Madam President? Ebele?" "I'm fine, Arthur," Ebele said, her voice calm, patting the CEO's hand gently. "The landing was a bit rough, but the differential thrust protocol held up. We need to overhaul the fleet's valve assemblies, though, effective immediately." "Done," Henderson promised, nodding vigorously. "Whatever you say, I'll ground the fleet tomorrow." Miller stepped forward, his world tilting on its axis again. "Mr. Henderson? Sir? I don't understand. This woman, she's a passenger. She was sitting in row 54. I moved her there myself." Henderson spun around, his face hardening into a mask of fury. "You moved her?" He gestured to Ebele. "Captain Miller, do you truly not know who this is?" Miller shook his head, his mouth dry as sand. "This is Ebele Sterling," Henderson announced, his voice ringing through the cockpit. "She isn't just a passenger. She is the founder and majority shareholder of Sterling Airways. She owns this airline. She owns this plane." Henderson pointed to the small brass plaque mounted on the cockpit door, a plaque Miller had walked past 1,000 times but never truly read. "Look at the dedication, Miller," Henderson snapped. "This aircraft, tail number GSTRL, was christened the Spirit of Ebele 5 years ago. You have been flying her namesake while treating her like garbage." Miller looked at Ebele. The pieces slammed together. The sterling on the tail, the technical knowledge, the confidence, the manual. Ebele stepped forward, clutching her canvas bag. She looked smaller than Miller, yet she towered over him. "I take these flights undercover once a month, Captain," Ebele said softly, "to see how my employees treat the people who pay our salaries. I wanted to see if we were maintaining the standards of dignity and respect I built this company on." She adjusted her glasses, her eyes piercing through him. "I found out that we have excellent pilots, Miller, but it seems we have a rot in the cockpit. You tried to have me arrested for saving my own property?" Miller opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked at the police who had lowered their hands from their weapons. He looked at the CEO who was looking at him with disgust, and finally he looked at the woman in the beige coat, realizing that the trash he had tried to throw to the back of the plane was the only reason he was standing on solid ground. The silence in the cockpit was heavier than the 300 tons of aluminum resting on the tarmac. Captain Miller stood frozen, a statue of a man whose entire world had just disintegrated into dust. He looked at Arthur Henderson, the CEO of the airline, and then at Ebele Sterling, the woman he had treated like a contagion for the last 7 hours. His brain was frantically trying to rewind time to find the moment where he could have fixed this. Maybe at the gate? Maybe when he stepped on her ticket? Maybe when he threatened her with jail? But every memory was a damning piece of evidence in a trial he had already lost. "Madam President," Henderson said, his voice trembling with a mixture of relief and outrage. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a pristine, monogrammed silk handkerchief. He offered it to Ebele with both hands, as if offering a tribute to a queen. "Your hands! You're covered in grease!" Ebele looked down. Her hands, the hands that had just rewired a dying plane, were stained black with hydraulic fluid and oil. She took the expensive silk square without hesitation. She didn't wipe her hands quickly. She did it slowly, methodically, scrubbing the grime from her fingers while Miller watched. "Thank you, Arthur," Ebele said softly. She finished cleaning her hands and dropped the ruined silk cloth onto the center console, right on top of the pilot's manual that had failed them. Then she turned to Miller. Miller flinched. He expected her to scream. He expected the rage he would have unleashed if the roles were reversed. But Ebele didn't scream. She was terrifyingly quiet. She adjusted her thick glasses, her eyes magnified and piercing, stripping away every layer of his arrogance until he felt naked. "Captain Miller," Ebele began, her voice calm, echoing slightly in the cramped space. "We need to clarify something. You are a skilled aviator. When I told you to execute the differential thrust, you did it. Your hands were steady on the yoke when it mattered. Technically, you are proficient." Miller let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. Hope, desperate and irrational, flared in his chest. "Thank you, Miss Sterling. I was just following training. The situation was chaotic. I did my best to—" "But—" Ebele cut him off, the word landing like a guillotine blade. She took a step closer to him. "An airline is not built on technical proficiency alone, Miller. It is built on trust. It is built on the promise that every soul on board, from the senator in 1A to the student in 54E, is treated with dignity." She gestured to the cabin door behind them. "Today you failed that promise. You didn't move me because of a safety concern. You didn't move me because of a double booking. You moved me because you looked at my coat, you looked at my skin, and you decided I wasn't worthy of the space you controlled." Miller opened his mouth to protest, to blame the system, to blame the stress, but the words died in his throat. "You judged me," Ebele continued, her voice hardening. "You saw a woman in a thrift store coat and assumed she was trash. You saw a black woman with a canvas bag and assumed she was a thief. You were so blinded by your own prejudice that you couldn't see the engineer standing right in front of you." I didn't know," Miller whispered, his eyes filling with tears of self-pity. "If I had known who you were—" "That is exactly the point," Ebele snapped, her composure cracking just enough to reveal the fire beneath. If you had known I was a billionaire, you would have treated me like royalty. You only respect people when you think they have power, and that, Captain Miller, makes you dangerous. A man who only serves the powerful will eventually sacrifice the weak, and on my airline, the weak are my responsibility. She turned to Henderson. Arthur, strip him. The command was simple, biblical. Henderson didn't hesitate. He stepped forward, his face grim. Captain Miller, surrender your badge, and your epaulets. Miller clutched his chest. No, please, Arthur, I have a mortgage. I have 2 kids in college. I've flown for this company for 20 years. You can't just end it like this over a seat assignment. You ended it, Henderson said coldly. Hand them over. With shaking hands, Miller unpinned the golden wings from his chest, the wings he had polished that morning, the wings he had worn like a crown. He handed them to Henderson. Then he reached up to his shoulders. He ripped off the 4 gold stripes, the symbol of his rank, the sign that he was a god of the sky. He held them in his hand for a second, feeling their weight, before Henderson snatched them away. Without the gold, the navy blue uniform looked like a costume. He looked small. He looked old. You are relieved of duty effective immediately, Ebele pronounced, her voice devoid of pity. Your flying privileges are permanently revoked. You will never sit in a cockpit of a Sterling Airways jet again, not as a pilot, not even as a passenger. Please, Miller begged, falling to his knees in the narrow space. I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. Save your apologies for the passengers you terrified, Ebele said, turning her back on him. Security! The 2 police officers stepped forward. They didn't salute Miller this time. They grabbed him by the arms, not gently. They hauled him up, turning him toward the exit. Let's go, sir, the officer said. Don't make a scene. Miller was dragged out of the cockpit, sobbing, a broken man leaving the kingdom he thought he owned. Ebele stood alone in the cockpit for a moment. She looked at the controls one last time. She touched the throttle she had used to save them. Then, she picked up her canvas tote bag. She put her technical manual back inside. She wrapped her pilling beige coat around her shoulders. Shall we go, Arthur? She asked. After you, Madam President, Henderson replied, bowing low. They walked out of the cockpit, through the galley where the stunned flight attendants were huddled. Veronica, the lead flight attendant who had tried to block Ebele, was pressing herself against the wall, terrifyingly pale. Ebele stopped in front of her. Veronica flinched, expecting to be fired on the spot. You, Ebele said softly. I'm sorry, Veronica wept. I'm so sorry, I didn't know. You stood your ground, Ebele said. You tried to stop a passenger from breaching the cockpit. You were wrong about who I was, but you were doing your job to protect the plane. Keep your badge, Veronica, but learn from this. Eyes open next time. Veronica sobbed, nodding frantically. Yes, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am. Ebele walked through the first-class cabin. The passengers, the tech mogul, the woman in pearls, were still in their seats, waiting to disembark. They saw the bag lady walking out, flanked by the CEO of the airline and the police. They saw the captain being led away in handcuffs ahead of her. The silence in the cabin was absolute. As Ebele passed seat 1A, she didn't look at it. She didn't need it. She stepped out onto the mobile staircase. The cool London air hit her face, smelling of jet fuel and rain. Below, on the tarmac, a fleet of ground crew, baggage handlers, and engineers had gathered. They had heard the news. They knew the founder was on board. As Ebele appeared at the top of the stairs, still wearing her old coat and holding her canvas bag, a ripple went through the crowd below. One by one, the ground crew stopped what they were doing. The baggage handlers dropped their scanners. The mechanics wiped their hands. They began to clap. It started as a trickle, then became a roar. They weren't cheering for a billionaire. They were cheering for the engineer who had saved the plane. They were cheering for the boss who rode in the back. Ebele paused on the stairs. She looked down at the sea of neon vests. She smiled, a genuine, tired, warm smile. She raised her hand in a small wave. Ahead of her at the bottom of the stairs, Captain Miller was being shoved into the back of a police cruiser. He looked up through the window, watching the woman he had called trash descending the stairs like a queen, bathed in the adoration of her people. He realized then, too late, the agonizing truth. He had spent his life polishing the outside of the cup, while the inside was full of greed. Ebele Sterling was the opposite. She was gold wrapped in paper. As the police car drove him away into obscurity, Ebele reached the tarmac. Henderson opened the door of a waiting black limousine. "Home, Madam President?" Henderson asked. Ebele looked back at the plane, her creation, battered but safe. "No, Arthur," she said, climbing into the car. "Take me to the engineering hangar. We have a hydraulic valve to redesign." The car door closed, sealing the legend inside. Captain Miller learned the hard way that a uniform doesn't make a leader, and a seat number doesn't define your worth. He judged a book by its worn-out cover, never realizing he was holding a masterpiece. In a world obsessed with appearances, remember this: the person you look down on today might be the one holding the keys to your tomorrow. True power doesn't need to scream. It doesn't need a first-class ticket. True power is humble, quiet, and ready to save the day when the engines fail. Be kind to everyone you meet. You never know who is really flying the plane.